Hello, I'm Rodney Alsop, and I would like to welcome you to the MBA News Digest webinar series for the month of September. I want to thank you for attending. This is the largest number I've had register. We capped it out at 50, and we did have 50 register, and people are still signing on right now. So appreciate the support. Now, project-based experiential learning does create a heavy workload for faculty, program leaders, and staff to manage. And frameworks, checklists, and ed tech companies are available that can help reduce this workload. And today, we'll take a look at all three. The MBA News Digest is pleased to be hosting today's webinar. My guest today is Jordan Levy. I met Jordan earlier this year. He became a subscriber to the MBA News Digest on January the 12th, and shortly thereafter sent me an email introducing himself and CapSource. We continued to share information back and forth, and I learned about Jordan and CapSource. And the more I learned, the more I became convinced that I needed to introduce Jordan and CapSource to the MBA News Digest community. Now, one of the things I discovered during this exchange of information is that Jordan was an accounting and finance major. I was an accounting major. So while we are both accountants, we're going to try to keep this as lively and interactive as we possibly can for two accountants. Now, what impressed me the most about Jordan is that he is an entrepreneur in the field of education technology, or ed tech. That is, using technology to enhance the student learning experience. Now, he was the co-founder of Real-Time Cases and now CapSource. And I think our industry has a lot to learn from companies like CapSource and people like Jordan. Now, let me, before we dive into this, let me do my disclosure thing. I want to make sure that all of you understand that the MBA News Digest has no relevant financial or non-financial relationships with CapSource to disclose. I invited Jordan because I think he has an important message and service that can be of benefit to some of you. Now, you may recall that I sent you a two-question survey a few weeks ago. The responses to that survey was amazing. I mean, it was unbelievable, the number of responses we got. And as we analyzed the results, we found your concerns focused on these 7 themes. By and large, and by a large margin, your biggest concern was project design, which was followed by project management. As we started preparing this webinar, we concluded that, both Jordan and I concluded that we could not do justice to both of these topics. So today we're going to focus on project design, and we've scheduled another webinar for November the 15th, where we'll focus only on the project management side. Now, let me turn this over to Jordan for part 1 of our webinar. Welcome, Jordan.
Thank you again, Rodney, for having me today. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here. I've known Rodney now for a little less than a year, and he's become a huge mentor for me, especially when it comes to really thinking through how project-based learning and experiential learning broadly can be used, most particularly in graduate programs, but also in undergraduate programs, across, frankly, the world. It's really exciting because obviously when you integrate companies into the learning process, there's a whole new paradigm when it comes to education. The faculty are no longer really the subject matter experts; they're a facilitator of learning, and so ultimately we have worked pretty hard to look at what the industry has been doing for about the last 30 years, and that's ultimately how we came up with these different engagement formats. Our hope and our goal through the CapSource model is to make experiential learning more attainable to students, more easy to implement for faculty, and more easy for schools to scale than if they otherwise were to rely on their own resources exclusively. So as a high-level overview, I think that probably the easiest way to get started here would be to kind of showcase what we define experiential learning as. And that's really what this slide is all about. So functionally, they really range in quite a few different facets. Obviously, the time commitment, whether or not there is a project-based learning component. So you'll notice a site visit is really just a one-day session. Usually there's no deliverable, but it's really about just getting students and companies into the same room. And then as you move from site visits up to live business cases and capstones, those two on the top are actually project-based learning experiences, which frankly we recommend trying to implement them at minimum over a 4-week period. And then we've seen success with these engagement structures over a two full semester period, so about 6 months, including some breaks. So the main difference between a live business case and a capstone is really the amount of students and the expectations in terms of outcomes, and also how it's used in the academic setting.
Let me ask a couple of questions about these 3 formats. First of all, if someone's out there that wants to get started doing this and they're wanting to try it on their own, is there sort of a pecking order? Do you start with site visits and then work your way on up in terms of a learning curve, I guess?
It's a great question. And, frankly, the reason why we start with this slide is because I think it's pretty important to kind of conceptually understand, what options there are when it comes to experiential learning with real third-party host companies. Experiential learning doesn't require that you work with, a third-party host, but I think specifically when you commit to using a company as part of the education process, there are really only a few formats that work, and that's kind of why we define these. So I would say site visits are the easiest to incorporate, and they're also easy to commit to, even if the syllabus is already set and you're pretty far along in the semester. They're obviously, they're a lot less engaging to the students, just in the sense that it takes a shorter amount of time. There's not as much warm up. There's not as much outcome focus as there is just really getting exposure for the students. I would say the other two are really dependent on, the resources at the school and the ultimate teaching goals. So a live business case, which you'll see in the 2 samples that we provide, are really designed for larger class sizes versus a capstone project. The prohibiting factor there is, in order to make it a capstone, it needs to be a small group of students that gets a lot of face time with the company. And that intimate relationship is ultimately what produces the really exciting environment and learning environment for the students, versus a live business case certainly revolves more on the faculty being a liaison, because there's so many students working on it at once. So as we get into the specifics of the examples, you'll see how there's really 2 different formats. One's a collaborative format and one's competitive when it comes to live business cases. But really, all 3 of them are attainable, as a pilot. It's really just more on kind of what resources and what the learning goals are.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
So, as I mentioned here, there's, I wanted to provide 2 examples. Both of these examples could easily have been capstone projects. The actual project outline and the project design process itself is pretty similar. Of course, you want to tailor the goal of the engagement and the business challenges to the learning objectives and the course content if you can. So that's really why I think it's important to start with the design process, even though in our checklist we actually start, obviously once you define that you want to do experiential learning, the next big step is really to start sourcing companies. But it's pretty critical to understand not only what format you'd like to use, how much time you're asking of the company, but also once you get a company to commit, what exactly within the company you'll need access to and whom in order to make the project successful. So in this situation, ICBE was our partner who hosted a live business case competition for schools in their that have been accredited by IACBE. They host the case competition every year. This past year in April was the first year they decided to turn it up a notch and use a live business case as opposed to a traditional written case. We of course were very excited to get involved with them. I had attended IACBE a few years prior to that and was really interested in taking that to the next level with a little bit more of a professional oriented nature to the case competition. So what's really exciting is we invited the executive team from the company to be a part of the process. They helped us design the competition and the project itself in order to be beneficial to them and also be engaging for the students and relevant. And they were also a part of judging the competition. So the process that we use, obviously, once you define, we're going to be designing a live business case. There's 8 student teams from 4 different countries participating. The rest of the format of the competition kind of falls into place. So the first thing, we did was define the project and the process that the students will be working through. At the highest level overview, Class Pulse is a really exciting startup. A student graduated from Georgetown, kind of frustrated that they never got a chance to submit feedback to their professors throughout the semester. And so she built a software product that allowed faculty to administer feedback via a mobile app. So, moving from defining the project and the process, obviously the outcomes were exceptional. We're scaling it next year. And it's a really exciting and engaging way to incorporate a company into a learning process, but not necessarily doing it in a non-scalable way, which oftentimes when folks look at capstones, because you need so many companies, it could be pretty burdensome, versus here, we were able to reach about 40, 50 students through the competition with one company, being the host.
Now, Jordan, I'm looking at this. Where or how were faculty involved in this design process?
So that's actually a great question. Faculty, especially when they're in these types of live business cases are integrated into a curriculum, are really involved in the project design process, especially when they leverage us as a third-party resource to help. In this case, the faculty actually mentored the student groups, and the project was actually designed with the team at IACBE as opposed to the faculty who were mentoring the students, which is traditionally how it works if you're incorporating this into a curriculum or a traditional course structure. But because this was a competition offered by IACBE, we designed the engagement with Class Pulse's goals in mind, and also the goals of IACBE and the case competition. So ultimately, every student group had a faculty mentor that was part of really just helping them get set up, and also logistically, getting them to the conference, making sure they were prepared. So they play a pivotal role in kind of troubleshooting, but it's really more so as a third-party resource to help, and not so much as as an instructor in the traditional sense.
Okay, thanks.
So on this next example, I figured it'd be helpful to throw this up here just so you could see how the same type of experiential learning can be used in the classroom. It's literally the same exact format of the project, which we'll get into shortly, of like how you think through designing these engagements. But the exciting part is ultimately companies are very interested in participating in the education process. They're interested in the outcomes that could be generated. They're interested in recruiting the students. And in this case scenario, this is actually a follow-up project to a capstone done by an MBA program. So the MBA students came up with an idea that if this company were to grow into a new city, they should go into Baltimore. And they assessed, they assessed DC being, the original city where this company was launched. The company is called Hungry. It's a marketplace connecting private chefs to companies for corporate catering. So ultimately, this project basically was handed from the MBA program to an undergraduate growth strategy class at the University of Maryland, taught by Dr. David Kirsch. And we essentially split up the next steps into three categories, or three departments, if you will: product, marketing, and organizational planning, or HR. And the general concept here was, if they were to grow into Baltimore, how would the company need to think about, adaptations to their product, to their marketing strategy, and to their team. And so, without getting too much into detail, I thought is a pretty cool example of how you could take a company, keep them engaged, pass them from one program to another, leverage the work that was done prior, by the MBA students, and then ultimately create an environment where David Kirsch, in this case, was a key role in designing the project with me, and Shai, the CEO of Hungary, and then he also was a liaison to get the information from Hungary to the students based on the types of discussions, a very cross-functional nature in class that were going on.
I forgot to mention earlier that when we did the survey, one of the things that everyone wanted was a checklist. And so Jordan put together a checklist, and you can download it by going to this URL. But I'll point out that when you complete the end of webinar survey, when you close it and submit your responses, it'll take you to this download so that you can get a copy of the checklist. And thanks, Jordan, for doing that.
Yeah, it's truly my pleasure. Every once in a while, getting an assignment like that from faculty, if you will, it really makes me think a little bit more about how to make this truly more approachable. How do you give this insight in a succinct manner? So essentially, I figured we'd extract the highest level overview and put it on that roadmap, which is the visual that you saw prior to this. And then extracting just the key steps, more or less here to set up experiential learning. It obviously starts by saying, hey, we're going to allocate resources and commit both financial resources and human resources to ensuring that this program will take off. And for each one of these steps, we actually go into a little bit of detail based on how other programs have built and scaled over time, and then also how we particularly help programs. And we incorporate quite a bit of recommendations based on what we've seen work in the past. So specifically, talking about the concept of selecting companies and designing great projects, I think it's pretty clear and pretty essential that when you do, decide to go with experiential learning in the classroom, the number one thing to focus on is selecting companies that will provide the best learning experience for the students. I can't emphasize that enough. There's obviously a compelling reason to choose big companies or brand recognizable names, but at the end of the day, if they're not going to be committed to the project, you might as well not be using a company at all in the learning process. So I think it's especially crucial when you're deciding which companies to work with ultimately, that you focus on the learning experience over all other things.
And Jordan, I had to laugh when I saw this because a lot of times we've got a company that's available, and I've heard faculty say, we're going to make this work. We can make it fit into our classroom, even though the learning objectives and so forth don't actually fit. So I think this is an excellent point. I'm glad you brought that out.
Absolutely. And this is a perfect example of what I was mentioning earlier with the checklist. So obviously I think it's important to start sourcing companies as step 2, as it is shown in our checklist. But, even in this presentation, I think before we even get to the company sourcing process, it's pretty important to kind of understand conceptually how the project design process works. And I know it's something that was heavily emphasized in the survey. So I'm actually going to talk a little bit about that first. And then we'll go into the company sourcing process once we kind of really understand how the project design process works, because project design is really agnostic of the company. You can count on the fact that companies do not understand how to design projects that will be beneficial to the students and fit in your curriculum. All they really know how to do is ask for help. And usually it's in the form of a business challenge, not necessarily a process that the students can do in order to deliver value. And so that's really what the process of designing a project is really all about, is not necessarily defining only the business challenge that the company is working through or hopes the students will be able to work through, but more particularly what the process should be in order for the students not only to learn about the company, learn about the challenge, learn about the industry, but also really start thinking through and solving some of those problems. So I think the next slide, Rodney, is really so this element of designing projects. We split into two key factors, which really come down to managing expectations. The concept of working with companies as part of the education process is pretty challenging because they are not familiar with the classroom any longer. Many of these folks haven't been enrolled in a traditional classroom setting for many years, especially if they're at the top of their organization. So just consider that as you're moving through the process, that really the idea here, be realistic with your expectations and manage theirs. This isn't a McKinsey consulting project. They're not going to get an exceptional amount of work for free, but really these are designed for the benefit of the student. And if they're designed properly and the students know ahead, are empowered with the resources to be successful, ultimately everyone will achieve great outcomes. But the more realistic you can be upfront, the better ultimately these engagements will go. So to specifically talk about the engagement design, the designing engagements and kind of setting expectations. So we break this down, especially this part, into really the first step is establishing the engagement goals and format. So the engagement format, we talked a little bit about live business cases and capstones. I'm not sure if you guys have tried any other formats. I haven't. We've distilled a whole bunch of different models down to kind of come up with these two concepts. So even if you're going to modify it one way or another, include more teams, include more companies, generally speaking, they should be the same structure. They should align course learning objectives with company goals. That's a crucial element for success, because if you ultimately have a finance class and you're not, there's a company that doesn't really have much meat to the bone when it comes to their accounting and finance system and the exports and the data that they can give you, it's going to be pretty difficult, to generate outcomes that are both beneficial to the company and a good learning experience for the students. And then, so what we always like to do is get a high-level commitment from the company and from specific departments that are relevant to the course. If you can't get that commitment and specific project champions within those departments that are going to be willing to interact with the students, it's going to be pretty hard to run the project smoothly. Once you get to that part, and you have that commitment, we always start by, really just doing anywhere from a half hour to an hour interview with those project champions, we call them, and essentially just outline at a high level what the business challenges are that they're dealing with. From there, there's two real crucial elements. One is to, create a project charter, which includes the process and milestones that the students will be working towards. And then we always recommend, if you can, to at least define, at least opaquely, what a deliverable would be for each of those. Because without that, it's really difficult to track whether milestones are being met. So we always break all of our projects into anywhere from 3 to 6 parts, depending on the rigor of the project and the capabilities of the students. Ultimately, once the project charter is created, a key component to think through is the engagement timeline. So, what are the actual dates that will be that we want both the students and the companies to keep in mind, that will be, physically meeting in person, or, of course, all of these engagements truly happen remotely. Even if they are localized in nature, meaning the students and the companies are within, driving distance of an hour and a half, 2 hours. They're not working at the company. They're not located at the company. Generally, they work remotely, and then there's a couple of instances throughout the semester, typically the kickoff date, any site visits to kind of see how the sausage is made, and then final presentations are usually at the very minimum what we want to see in person. But again, all of those can really be orchestrated fully online with digital tools, like web conferencing, like what we're doing now, project management tools. We have a partner organization called EduSource, which is software to help manage these types of engagements. So there are certainly tools out there to really help manage these engagements, but those are, generally speaking, the critical elements of project design. The checklist does go into a decent amount of detail about kind of how this process works, but more or less, I can't emphasize enough that the companies have no idea how to design a project that's going to be useful for the students and also useful for them. So that's really a process that falls on the plate of faculty, especially if they're not using an outside resource like us. And I really don't know too many organizations that do sit in between faculty and companies and kind of have a process for this. So, of course, we're always happy to help. Especially we split our value proposition into sourcing companies and designing the engagement. So there are a few of our clients that just use us for engagement design, versus some that use us for company sourcing plus engagement design. So I think the second element here, and I touched on it briefly, is identifying good project champions. You'll notice that the biggest circle here is that a project champion should be authorized over the project areas and departments that are involved in the project. If they're not, it's going to be extremely, extremely difficult to do a successful project, because that means they need to interact with folks at their firm to get access to that information. So at the very minimum, sometimes we call them project champions, the direct intermediary for between the students and companies. And then we have a project supervisor where, if the company wants to allocate a lower level manager to do these projects, which often is something we recommend, just for the purposes of that company training a younger employee how to manage a group. Make sure there's at least somebody that's supervising that individual that does have access to what's needed, because if not, it's going to be pretty difficult. Every time you're going back and forth, it might take weeks to get the data or the information needed to kind of move from step to step. So that I say is the most crucial element. Obviously, the other ones are kind of more soft skills that you have to make a judgment on. Are they organized? Are they responsive? Are they committed to doing the project? The second part, and this is truly where most schools drop the ball, is the actual selecting companies. It's really soliciting companies and selecting the ones that come out of that process. It is literally a sales process, from like through and through. To convince someone to participate, even if you're not charging the companies, which frankly, we always highly, highly recommend that you do not. There are, of course, very successful programs that do. I think that at least for the first few years, to get the process off the ground, to get faculty familiar with being in this role of the liaison and not the subject matter expert, we really, we don't want companies expecting outcomes because they're paying for them. We really just want the commitment that they're willing to participate, and they can show that commitment in other ways than a financial commitment. Most particularly, ask for information up front. especially during the design process. If you know that there's going to be some data component, ask for that data immediately. Because if they're willing to give it to you, then that's a pretty good indicator that they're willing to play ball. Keep in mind, one thing I didn't mention earlier was the process of NDAs, and every company, especially the larger ones, they'll have custom legal paperwork. It's something to talk to either the school's general counsel or other faculty at the school that have done similar things in the past. Usually it's not a problem, but some schools have really particular details around what students can and can't sign. And usually in order to get access to really good information, you're going to have to sign some NDAs, and we create a custom rules of engagement, which kind of defines the role of everyone involved. So kind of back to this, again, essential part here is really, can you sell the companies on the concept of the program and the outcomes that the students are going to be able to produce?
So Jordan, one of the things that strikes me here is, instead of looking at this as a one-off situation with this company for this semester, for this course, you really need to be thinking about selecting these companies for the long term and looking at them as a partner in this for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So the seventh step in our checklist is managing accounts. And we're going to touch on that briefly towards the end of this segment. But ultimately, the most successful programs retain companies semester over semester. Big challenges, a lot of these programs only run yearly. Of course, if you can get the companies to sign up for next year, that's great. But 8 months in a corporate environment is a long time, and a lot can change, and the people involved can change. So if you can keep the company involved at the school level semester over semester, even if it requires handing it over to another department to do a project, we always recommend, if they're interested in doing a project, find a course to do the project, or at least a student group for them to engage with, because at least then it becomes part of their human resources model. They'll generally be ready to have an individual available to manage these projects. They're used to the cadence and things along those lines.
Thank you.
Surely. So again, I mentioned this, I'll emphasize it again. It's really a sales process to get companies involved. A crucial element of the sales process is marketing and, more or less packaging. How are you communicating the idea of this program to third parties? I think a good version of this that most generic programs will have is at least a web page. Sometimes they'll have, company names that have participated in the past. Sometimes they'll have, a brief project overview or maybe a case study on the outcomes. The more material that you can get in front of potential hosts, the better. I think the best is obviously a video testimonial, or highlight reel, if you will. Think about it, from a perspective of, selling any type of product. If they can really see other companies that have gone through the process talking highly about the program and the students and the outcomes that they get, obviously it's going to be easier to convince them to commit. Other features that you can add to the page are, a form or an email contact that somebody can reach out to if they're interested in participating. But the general concept here is get this in front of as many people as possible. And we always recommend that the marketing starts about 6 months prior to when the engagement is kicked off. So for example, if you're trying to do a spring project, truly, you should get that started in the middle of the summer, especially if you want to find very specific types of companies and challenges. And then we always try and make sure at the very minimum 2 weeks before the project is fully designed, but all the commitments are done at least 2 months before, so that this way there's no surprises as the semester's coming up. Companies are dropping out and all that stuff. Get the full commitment, as far in advance as you can.
So is it advisable to have all of this kind of centralized? If you've got 3 or 4 departments in the B school, in your program and so forth. In other words, you really don't want a bunch of people trying to recruit the same company for 3 different projects at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a very nuanced challenge for schools that are doing this at scale. I would say, depending on where you are in your life cycle of incorporating experiential learning, that's probably not much of a risk in the beginning. But if you're offering 20, 40, 80, over 100, companies, that's when you really need to start thinking about, having a department or at least a CRM of some kind to manage this. I know, Salesforce integration is a tool that some schools use to kind of manage this. Some schools will look towards the career service department and use those tools to kind of monitor. Ultimately, it's pretty tough if a lot of people are soliciting the same companies, especially if the same companies tend to continually engage with the school. This is one of the perils of just the natural way, organizations, universities are set up, is that there's very little communication, interdepartment. So, ultimately, I'll just emphasize here, since Rodney brought this up, but, that the outcomes are not obvious. So even if you can get companies to participate, you still got to prove a lot by having them go through the process and have a good experience. The by far easiest way to not have a scalable experiential learning program is to not retain host companies. And so ultimately, the schools that do really well with companies that we pair them with, we ultimately provide, a deal where they can kind of sign up the same company again. We'll just hop right in and scope the project and then send them off and running pretty easily, because there's material and there's familiarity with the company, especially if it's the same faculty running it over and over again. So just keep that in mind. It's extremely crucial to retain companies if you want to scale this program so that you can reach hundreds of students and not dozens of students.
Okay.
So part of any sales process is aggregating a target list. Location, size, and industry are the critical factors. Is it essential that they're local? Are you looking for companies at a certain size? If it's a Fortune 1000, it's going to be tougher to get them involved. Is there a specific industry that pairs well with the course? The more you can define that, the better, especially because it'll help ultimately generate a target list of leads, and then you could reach out to those leads and see if they're interested with the marketing material that's been produced. We always recommend leveraging networks at the school, especially if you're doing this alone. Obviously, CapSource is a network in and of itself, and we come with the project design process. Other examples are the alumni network, small business development office, entrepreneurship centers, the local chambers of commerce. Even, going through LinkedIn and seeing, Lehigh, I went to Lehigh, so Lehigh alumni, president of the organization or CEO, it's a good way to kind of find viable prospects. Second part of any sales process is to manage the funnel. We always recommend reach out 10 times the amount of people than you need. So if you need 10 companies, it means you have to reach out to about 100. At the very minimum, that means you might get more commitments, which is great, and then you get to choose the ones that look best for the program or the learning objectives. But keep that in mind, because the last thing you want to see is push comes to shove. It's 5 days out from when you need to finalize all the projects by. It's probably a vacation coming up, and you have to spend all your time continuing to solicit as opposed to just choosing the ones that have already committed. And this is the last part of the process, especially in our checklist. We actually got some feedback from one of my mentors who has been scaling a program at William and Mary and one at University of Maryland for quite some time, that managing accounts kind of pairs well with scaling the program. So not only is it important to continually engage the companies, find other ways for them to get involved on campus, survey them, feature them in newsletters, just they're a partner. They're more or less a client of the school, because they look at this kind of similar to how they look at consulting projects. So the more benefit you can provide them outside of just the student outcomes, the better. And a lot of the reason why they participate to begin with is because students, are interested in working at these companies. So, managing accounts, so to speak, is really about, nurturing a relationship, especially once they've already committed once. Getting them to re-sign up is much easier the second time around if they had a good experience. And if you can keep in touch with them throughout that process, it makes that even more intuitive for them, rather than, some new resource joining the organization, not having heard of you, for the last 9 months. And then, now it's time again to do a project. You want them to be familiar. Hey, deadlines are coming up, or fill out this form if you're interested again this year. There are certainly rudimentary ways to do this. And then obviously you can incorporate technology tools like MailChimp and automated emails and all that jazz as your program scales. But just some things to keep in mind.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you again for this opportunity to kind of walk you guys through at least our model and how we look at experiential learning at schools. It's an experience, frankly, that I didn't get very much when I was at school, and I graduated Lehigh not too long ago. So, I'm consistently working with that school and many others to try and get them, try and make the process easier for them to incorporate companies into the education process. Our value proposition comes down to eliminating a lot of these parts of the process for schools, and centralizing it as part of our business model and product, as opposed to every single school, needing to have their own lead generation process and their own, project scoping process and their own formats. And it just gets really difficult for companies, especially because, they have 3 different schools reaching out to them to do capstone projects, except one calls it a field consulting and one calls it an MBA capstone. And all these names, and they're all the same thing. It's just about getting students, an opportunity to think about real challenges, put together some viable solutions, and ultimately get feedback based on, their work. Ultimately, all of our engagements are designed to provide students with referenceable work experience when they're, going through interviews. So, we want to really make the process easier, and that's ultimately why we created a platform that allows faculty to find companies willing to participate, and ultimately we help with the project design process to make that a little bit easier as well. So again, every single element we talked about today and then some is included in our value proposition, establishing the engagement goals, identifying the project champions and interviewing them, coming up with the marketing materials for your specific program to solicit the companies, getting a list of leads together and kind of converting them into commitments and projects. That's exactly what we do. And of course, always available to chat about how this could be, tailored to your specific school's process, no matter what stage your experiential learning is in. So ultimately, our value really kind of break it down into these buckets. Obviously, there's a community. You guys are a part of that just by attending this webinar. The formats that we use, the site visits, live business cases, and capstones. And then we also have project components. We call them project blocks that we know work really well. So for example, if you go to a company on our platform and you're interested, you can actually look and see, what other marketing projects, for example, students have done with similar companies. And we find that to be a pretty crucial part of the project design process. So, obviously to the students, it's a new experience because it's a new company, it's a new industry, it's a new size, but the actual block, whether it's, hey, do, a competitive analysis and then, a SWOT analysis, so that you can kind of compare their industry peers to one another. It's pretty similar and consistent regardless. Go ahead, Rodney.
I've got a couple of questions here that I think would fit in here. One is, When the experiential learning opportunity is designed as a competition, how is the winner determined?
Yeah, that's actually definitely something we're going to talk about in the next webinar. There's actually an article we published in conjunction with a faculty from Wake Forest, Dr. Ann Lambros, who's been doing project-based learning for years, and we actually provide sample rubrics, and one of those rubrics is the rubric used for the ICBE case competition. So on the resources section of our website, there's a thought leadership tab. Check that out, and then you'll see it's how to grade students in project-based learning. I think grading students comes down to two critical elements. One is there's the whole process of the project, and then two is the ultimate deliverable. You kind of have to think about it like how you think about managing a team in a traditional kind of consulting environment. Obviously, faculty kind of pseudo play the role of the engagement director. The students are the consultants, junior consultants, and ultimately, are they communicating? Are they working as a team? Can you be a part of evaluating their process, while they're going through it? And then ultimately, the deliverable, we always recommend, at least be weighted pretty heavily in the process. So, get the company's feedback on how they think it went. But of course, that's not as crucial as how the faculty feels the ultimate deliverable was produced. And then our deliverables, at the very minimum, we always recommend an actual presentation that they need to deliver, either digital or in person, and then a highly detailed report that provides a synopsis of all of the findings from the engagement. So again, we'll talk a lot more about that. Check out the resource on the website. And then if you have more questions or you want to see more samples, anytime, I'm always happy to help. Of course, we're an early stage company. We've reached about 15 universities over the course of the last year. Rodney touched very briefly on kind of my background. This actually happens to be my second ed tech company, also an experiential learning focused company. So the concept here is really we're a marketplace. Almost if you think about what Airbnb does, for travelers and folks that are interested in hosting their using their own homes or a specific room to rent it out. It's kind of how we look at how our marketplace is set up. So you'll notice on the left-hand side of the screen, we try to make the process easy to find companies, and we have a directory. Each and every one of them, if they're on there, is interested in working with students immediately. We actually just recently launched a way for students, as part of a club or part of a consulting group of friends, even if they're interested in working with companies, they can actually request these projects themselves. But the model is technically designed for faculty, especially when they want to incorporate it into the classroom. You could search by specific departments that you want involved. So if you're teaching a marketing class and you want data and marketing and product to be a part of the learning process, you check those off. And then the results would show for all companies that have those three areas open for collaboration. You can also search by the type of collaboration, and a few other things like distance from the school and whatnot. On the right-hand side of the screen is an example profile. Every company has to fill out all this information. We're specifically tailoring it to the type of learning experiences that we offer. So, is the company willing to work remotely? Do they want to only work with undergrads or grads or both? Are they willing to hire students afterwards? All things that we think go into the consideration process for faculty. And then I mentioned this briefly earlier, but each one of these departments, there are sample assignments that have been run in the past and have been successful, especially for companies at that size. It's still a work in progress because we really want to make them great. So we're leveraging advisors and tweaking and adding more. So some of them have not been finalized yet. But if you're interested in seeing the types of challenges that students have worked on through our platform, take a look at a specific profile, and you can, of course, look at the project blocks associated with each of the departments. Another way to do this, and we always highly recommend checking out the experiential learning page of the website, which is also under resources, the resources tab. That actually provides not only a high-level overview of all three of the types of experiential learning, but it also has a pretty detailed overview of specific, it's actually the actual project that the students worked on. So we took the company's project and put it up there, including the ICBE case, if you want to see specifically how that was formatted and orchestrated. And then ultimately, on the right-hand side, it's really about developing students professionally through immersive hands-on learning experiences. I can't emphasize enough. It's really something that, every single time I'm in the room with students, I get more and more impressed. There's a couple pictures here from Ramapo College of New Jersey, who worked with a Verizon entity. And it was just exceptional to see, the company, VPs, directors, everyone just involved and excited to get student feedback. And, they're working on a really exceptionally cool product in the VR space, and, kind of just really wanted to get students' opinions. And the students were thinking about the pricing strategy and ways to actually package the product. So feel free to read these, on your own time. They're just a bunch of high-level testimonials from the different stakeholders that are involved. Obviously we care deeply about the student learning experience and the host company experience, and we also really want to make this approachable and easy for our faculty. None of this would be possible without the faculty involved. Of course, there are ways for students to learn and use our platform without the help of faculty, but in those cases we'll involve industry mentors and other ways to support those students. But truthfully, if this is involved in the classroom context, I think that's the best learning experience. And anything else other than that, I'd be happy to answer. So thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time to be with us today. I want to just say thank you again to Rodney specifically, not only for the work he does for MBA and business programs by sharing just really interesting news through his newsletter, but also helping to support entrepreneurs like me who are really just trying to help and be a part of the process. So at any point, if you have any questions, feel free.
And I saved one question to last, which I knew would come. How much do you charge for all of this?
That's a great question. So yeah, we charge $2,500 per company, totally regardless of the format used. For us, it's the same because there's always going to be an engagement design process. There's always going to be the sale process. So for us, the multiple is the company. So if a school needs 10 companies, it'll be 25,000. If a school needs 20, we try to cap our fees for the year at $50,000. As long as it doesn't get too absurd and there's like hundreds of companies, but most of our clients are still early stage with experiential learning. So there's also pilot discounts that we can offer if you're an individual faculty or you want to offer this but can't get funding from the school. We can do student pricing, which is certainly a possibility. So we're trying to keep the price reasonable. It ends up coming out to be anywhere from about $100 to $200 per student. And then if you're doing a live business case, with 100 students, it could be as low as $25 a student. So keep that in mind. Of course, happy to answer any questions offline about our pricing or any of how we get started with schools if anybody's interested.
Okay, thanks, Jordan. I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed this. This has been wonderful. And our next webinar is November 15th at 2 p.m. and it's going to deal with the project management side of this. Once again, I want to thank you for joining us today for this webinar, and I look forward to seeing you on November 15th for the next webinar. Thank you.